Welcome. We're so glad to see you here. I'm president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit organization. As mentioned, we'll be discussing a 1964 dark comedy anti-war film called The Americanization of Emily, directed by Arthur Hiller, written by Patty Chayefsky, and starring James Garner and Julie Andrews. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to our wonderful film historian, Max Alvarez. Max?
And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and supporters of New Plaza Cinema online, our talkback sessions. I am Max Alvarez. Americanization of Emily, which MGM released in 1964, was Julie Andrews' second major film appearance in the same year that she came to the screen in Disney's Mary Poppins, having lost out in My Fair Lady to Audrey Hepburn. This was a film that was a series of successes for Julie Andrews that will be followed the following year by the blockbuster The Sound of Music. We have two veterans of television collaborating on this feature film. Director Arthur Hiller, who came from Canada, who started out in Canadian radio, did television work up there, and eventually is going to be directing for American television series, including Alfred Hitchcock Presents. All roads lead to Alfred Hitchcock, as I'm sure you understand by now, is going to be directing around his third feature film with The Americanization of Emily, which will be his most acclaimed film or most notable success before Love Story comes out 6 years later and is a massive, massive blockbuster. Writing the adaptation to the novel is, as Norma mentioned, screenwriter Patty Chayefsky, who, like Arthur Hiller, had cut his teeth in television and had found tremendous success in the 1950s with his teleplay Marty, which was turned into a smash sleeper feature film with Ernest Borgnine and won the Academy Award for Best Picture. So by this time, Chayefsky is already well established as a provocative adult writer. And as Norma indicated, there is an element of black or dark comedy to this World War II era story with anti-war themes set in England around 1944 on the eve of D-Day. How did MGM sell The Americanization of Emily in 1964? Let's take a look at the original trailer that would have been shown in cinemas that year.
You lack principles, Charlie. Isn't there anything you'd die for?
Well, easy, Tiger. That's a tailored shirt.
Oh, shut up and let me kiss you.
The first dead man on Omaha Beach must be a sailor.
Who is it?
Who is barging?
Boss, the strangest thing just happened.
Say, Charlie, close
The
the
Admiral
door.
came barging into my room in his nightshirt, Buzz yelling at the top of his lungs, the first dead man on Omaha Beach must be a sailor.
Every few years, there comes a motion picture so extraordinary, so provocative, that it excites controversy and curiosity from its very inception. Such a film, one of the most important and talked about in more than a decade, is The Americanization of Emily.
Well, it's a hell of a D-Day, that's all I can say.
How did we ever get into what tomb?
Well, the tomb for the unknown sailor.
Unknown sailor. Holy cow!
Commander, I think you're out of your ever-loving mind.
But it all ends in someone's bed, doesn't it? I mean, that's the point, isn't it?
Think I want to tell my kids that on D-Day their father was shacked up at the Westchester Hotel? Will you stop jumping around?
Well, I'm naked, dear. I'm looking for something to put on.
This is my best friend, you Dolly Witch, not the house detective. Now, just stand at attention while Commander Madison and I confer. I'm a practicing coward.
You're quite dog robber.
I arrange girls, but individual tastes varied, of course.
You're despicable.
You're a scoundrel, Charlie. Seems I don't mind making love to a scoundrel, but I think it immoral to marry one.
Oh, we're gonna make a brass band hero out of Charlie.
How could you do this to me?
Get your pants on, Mac.
You're forever falling in love with men on their last nights of furlough. That's about the limit of your commitments. One night, a day, a month. You'd prefer lovers to husbands, hotels to homes.
I'm gonna slap your face, Charlie.
Go ahead, I won't hit you back. I'm a coward.
So this is a fairly cynical take for Hollywood on World War II. We don't usually see an element of cynicism or dark comedy in World War II Hollywood films. At least we won't be seeing that until the decade is nearing completion with Mike Nichols's adaptation of Joseph Heller's Catch-22, and in the early 70s, George Roy Hill's adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. But here you have a World War II, and I see Gary is among our audience. If Gary, anytime you like, you can jump right in. I know there's some cinema requirements that Gary is involved with right now, but he will be joining us during the course of this discussion. But here we have a World War II where there's a lot of opportunism going on. James Garner's character is basically providing all the elegant trimmings of decadent bourgeois living to the brass, while presumably everyone else in Europe is dealing with cutbacks and food shortages. He appears to be very anti-war and not wanting to be part of the war machine. He'll take what he can get out of it as long as he can preserve his own life. The Julie Andrews character of Emily has lost her father, her brother, and her husband to the war. So she is feeling suffering a great deal, and is not quite knows what to make of this ladies' man who's patting women on the backside until she slaps his face. And that was the first big laugh I got from the film. And seems to be quite a bit of contradictory messages running through the narrative of the Americanization of Emily. The title itself, based on the novel, it's a cynical twist on Americanization, because when Julie Andrews' Emily is Americanized, essentially she's selling out her ideals at the end. She's sacrificing her principles and thereby showing her true Americanization. I think that may be lost on a lot of viewers of the film because it comes so close to the happy ending, the climactic clinch, when James Garner's character, he is all the way ready to speak out against his experiences, unwillingly drawn into the Normandy landing for D-Day, when Emily convinces him that he should play along with this game, with this basically public relations ploy that the military supervisor of Melvin Douglas has in store in order to preserve or expand his beloved Navy. So we're led to believe that Emily, having had these tragic losses in her family, is now going over to the other side and actually wanting to go along with the selling of the war in order to appease whatever feelings she has for the American James Garner, and he's kind of developing more of a reserved British take on his experiences. We can discuss and debate whether these transitions are convincing, whether the dark humor, whether the political irony get lost in translation, or whether they are readily in evidence. But I would love at this point for Dan Cahill to join me, our filmmaker and film teacher, who's going to talk a little bit more about his reactions to the Americanization of Emily and other aspects. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Max. And before you leave, and before I start sharing my images, I'm going to have things beyond just the look of the film to talk about because I listened carefully to Hiller's audio commentary on the DVD, and he tossed out a lot of interesting stuff. Perhaps the most interesting thing is he says this is his own favorite film that he made. He said it's also the favorite film of James Garner, James Coburn, Julie Andrews, and, no surprise, of Paddy Chayefsky. So Hiller also directed The Hospital about 8 or 9 years later, also written by Chayefsky, and he says he much prefers Emily to The Hospital. So I think that's interesting stuff. And a lot of people in my generation think of it as a very favorite film.
And just to clarify, so The Hospital came out in 1971, and I will be talking about The Hospital. In fact, we'll be culminating with a clip from The Hospital when I discuss 1971, the movie year, or the year in cinema, a week from Wednesday.
Okay.
We'll talk more
Good
about our
tie-in,
favorite
Max.
films. I'll be back.
Okay. Well, here we go. The Americanization of Emily is indeed the title. This is one of the first shots that I thought was kind of effective. I've often talked about how a director will like to have both actors facing the camera or visible to the camera so that he doesn't have to do a lot of cutting back and forth between close-ups. We also learn extra little stuff here. The car is crowded with Charlie's contraband, if you can call it that. And there's also a pretty effective rear projection shot in the background. This was clearly shot in a studio, but it's a nice visual introduction in the film. One of the main things I'm going to talk about here today is how Hiller uses background activity to put the foreground activity sometimes in counterpoint, and often just to deepen the frame and give a sense of activity about, this is a war and people are working hard. This is the scene where Emily and Sheila talk about going to the parties and having a good time. And she is clearly bothered by this, but we learn more about that as over the course of the film. This is a favorite shot of mine. Hiller has set it up so that there are 4 bridge players, but one of them, the general, has to lay his hand down and go and observe the rest of the game standing up. So this gets them all facing the camera. And in the background, on the couch in the middle ground, is James Coburn romancing yet another woman. And in the background is our friend Sheila being escorted over to an armchair by another patron of the party. So this is a busy frame, but the focus, of course, is on the discussion at the bridge table. This is one of many long takes in the film, and I am unable to show you the full long take for you so you can appreciate what goes on. But in still frames, I will show you 3 frames from this long take. This is the party, the drunken party in the Admiral's suite. And it begins with Edward Binns is the actor on the right. And there's Admiral Jessup, played by Melvin Douglas, on the bed. They've been clowning around and talking about stuff. The camera pulls back into a wider shot, and we see 3 or 4 people in the frame. And then we end up in a close-up over James Coburn's shoulder, hearing a very important bit of ranting from the Admiral about the dead man on Omaha Beach. Now, what's interesting in Hiller's description of why he does long takes, he talks about something that occasionally directors will refer to. I, being the kind of artsy guy, like to talk about how a long take pulls the audience in and immerses it. But interestingly enough, directors make long takes not because they're easy, they're complicated and a challenge to shoot, but it makes it impossible, at least in these moments, for the studio to come in and recut the scene. It just won't look good, it won't make any sense. And this is something that Hiller feared. I have also heard John Huston commenting on that he tried to make his films in such a way, in such a way that nobody could come in afterwards and re-edit them. So this is a function of the studio system. And this was MGM. And it was one of Hiller's first films. He was regarded as young and inexperienced. And I can tell you more about who he replaced on this. Rather interesting stuff. Here we see the use of stock footage as a backdrop in a rather tense confrontation between Charlie and the Admiral. There is a lot of stock footage in this film, which is probably indicative of their lower budget, that they couldn't actually go out and film this kind of scene for what is clearly a military training film. Now, there are two actors in this film, neither of them major, but supporting roles, who ended up in Laugh-In a few years. This is Judy Carne, who was British, and Mr. Hiller said that at the time she was married to Burt Reynolds, and that Burt Reynolds kept coming after Hiller, telling him, no nudity, I don't want her naked, no nudity. Well, we understand why a husband might do that, but the odds of MGM releasing a film with explicit nudity in 1964 just are non-existent. It would never have happened. So it seems a little absurd. Maybe it was Burt just being overprotective of Judy. Here is one of several shots of the Admiral after he has had a mental lapse. And in this case, once again, I can't show it here, but the camera begins on one side of him and pulls out in front of him so that we can see Charlie coming up behind him to massage his shoulders. Effective use of the camera and camera movement. Here we have yet another background thing. Sweet young thing in the background, one of Bus's women, whom in that era were always called girls. Here we have a kind of an interesting scene between the two of the men about what they're going to do about this Omaha Beach business. And there's his young woman in the background going about her business, filing her nails, waiting for the scene to end. This is the rain scene filmed at Santa Monica Airport. And it's a powerful scene. It steers the movie in a different direction. And it's really wet. And I timed the scene. It's 6 minutes long. And just by comparison, Gene Kelly's famous dance number in the rain is 4 minutes long. This must have been a trial for the actors, I'm assuming. This is the worst stock footage I've ever seen. It in no way matches the original, but they needed a visual representation of the fact that D-Day had been postponed a day. So it was supposed to be shocking. It's also shocking in that the photography doesn't match at all. But that's, once again, function of a somewhat low budget. Here is one of my favorite character actors. Every time I see him, I start to smile. This is Keenan Wynn, son of Ed Wynn, who played the Cowardly Lion. And right at this point, young Mr. Wynn was kind of on a roll. He had just been seen about 9 months earlier in Dr. Strangelove, playing the curious figure of Colonel Bat Guano. I'm sure we all remember that scene about the Coca-Cola machine. And soon after this, I think in about another year, he was going to appear in another favorite film of mine, The Great Race, as Hezekiah, who was the assistant to Tony Curtis. This is a genuinely funny scene where he's drunk, he says he's stoned, but he's not that stoned. Another indication of the low budget, as Mr. Hiller said, they did tight shots whenever there were supposed to be a lot of extras because they didn't have that many extras. Hence, when he's in the landing boat like this, it's a fairly tight shot, which kind of implies that there are more men further to either side, but this is all they could afford to shoot. This is the other Laugh-In character. The actor is Alan Sues, and I suggest you look him up. S-U-E-S, first name Alan, A-L-A-N. And in Laugh-In, he played an well out of the closet, flamboyant, over-the-top gay person, which when you think back on it, it was odd that they got away with that on network television, but Laugh-In broke down a lot of barriers. Here he is playing a very straightforward role of an experienced cameraman who's trying to talk them out of getting into the water with the camera. Not a very meaningful part, but he had a big impact on Laugh-In. Here is the California beach where they filmed the Normandy landing. And Mr. Hiller was kind of ashamed to admit that this beach, which looks really good, it was, they scouted a lot of different beaches. The name of this place is Hollywood by the Sea. That's what its real name is. And he tried to keep that quiet during the production. Well, it's interesting what one close-up can do to change the course of a film. This view comes after we learn that Charlie is still alive. And the Admiral has just said, if Charlie were here right now, he'd be laughing his head off. Well, this turns the film in another direction. He's not happy. And here we are, speaking of happy, this is the happy ending. You have almost all three of them smiling. You can tell pretty much that Julie Andrews is pretty happy about all this. So that's the end of my presentation, but I have more stuff to share with you. Has Gary joined in yet? Anybody know?
Yes.
Gary Palmucci, our programmer at New Plaza Cinema. Gary, welcome. This is a good opportunity for you. I know Dan is going to continue shortly, but Gary, if you have any
sorry, I had to duck out there. We had what appeared to be an issue with the air conditioning in the theater. It was a false alarm, and we're back up and running. I don't know how much you guys covered while I was away prior to Dan's presentation. I saw, Max, some of what you said. I guess what strikes me about this particular movie year is that we had about half a dozen, at least, movies that were lampooning or questioning or giving some different look at war or the military that perhaps we had seen much of in Hollywood films up to that point. Of course, we had the immortal Dr. Strangelove, will always be the king of the lot. 7 Days in May by John Frankenheimer. This film, The Americanization of Emily. One of Robert Redford's early films, Situation Hopeless But Not Serious, set in World War II. And also Failsafe by Sidney Lumet, also featuring some of the cast of this movie. And this was even before Vietnam really started to heat up. We had the Gulf of Tonkin incident in the summer of 1964, but it wasn't for another year or so before that started to obsess the minds of the American public. And I guess, I don't know whether you guys identified it or not, but the motif of this series for the month of June that we came up with was sort of like war movies that mostly take place far from the battlefront. And also, just by coincidence, we were digging deep into Network a couple months ago, and this was yet another instance of Paddy Chayefsky. They took a big bite out of the hand that fed them in Network, and this was his only screen credit, I guess, of the 1960s. Maybe he was busy as a playwright or on TV, and we know a little bit more about that.
May I just interject an interesting
Please.
thought about Chayefsky? Mr. Hiller talked about trying to persuade him to take the assignment to adapt this novel. And he came out to California, had meetings with producers and others, and he flew back to New York saying, I really can't do this. I don't think I can get it to work. And then a day or so later, he called back and said, I figured it out. I'm going to make it kind of a dark satire on the military and the absurdity of war. Now, this ties into the way MGM was feeling about this project. Some people thought that it would come out as anti-American. Others thought it would appear to be anti-war. And the real message is, if you just listen to the dialogue, it's about anti-glorification of war. And I remember when I was a college freshman watching this for the first time, I remember thinking, wow, that stuff I could really agree with. This movie makes a lot of sense. And it stuck with me for many, many years.
Well, Max, I don't know which trailer you ran, but one of the trailers I looked at tried to stress the controversial aspects of the film, which didn't necessarily come across in the trailer. But
it was a choppy trailer, the one we ran, the original one from '64. Little snatches of dialogue here and there, lots of explosions going off. I'm not sure if that's the same one you saw, Gary, but it would have been fascinating to see what kind of a movie would have come out 4 or 5 years later. I imagine they would have gone even darker with it.
Well, having just seen Network, it seemed to me, and probably to many of our viewers as well, that it was really kind of cut from the same piece of cloth in terms of the The writing style, and in this film, all three of the main characters, Garner in the scene you just talked about in the rain, Julie Andrews, James Coburn, they all have what I would call a Chayefsky rant, where they rant for like,
Yes.
4 or 5 minutes or so. And
almost a little like Aaron Sorkin these days.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and the production company Filmways, which produced Americanization of Emily, one of the producers there was John Calley, who's later going to become a very important executive at Warner Brothers and then
legendary studio executive.
He's a legendary studio executive who took a lot of risks in the early 70s at Warner's. But before he went to Warner's, he produced Mike Nichols's Catch-22. So it's safe to assume that had this been made in 1970, they would have gone even further than they could have. And clearly he was sympathetic to some of the themes that were running through the narrative. Not having read the novel, I can't comment on what changes they made in the third act, whether there were any compromises or whether they beefed up some of the more subversive elements.
Yeah, I don't even know if that's a novel you could find easily today. Maybe somebody does.
I have on order the last available copy in the Amazon marketplace of the mass market paperback movie tie-in edition. So in a couple of weeks, I may be able to inform you people.
Well, the novelist had one interesting credit. He wrote the novel on which one of Elia Kazan's underrated films, Wild River, was based on, apparently.
Interesting.
That's a very important piece of information. So there obviously was some great value to his narratives.
And one more thing about writing, Hiller reported that so many people just loved the script that in effect what they filmed was the first draft of the script. He said they might have changed a few words here or there, but this is basically what Chayefsky turned in as a first draft. So,
well, he sounds like one of these guys that he probably didn't, like Harold Pinter or Neil Simon, or he didn't take to, changes in his dialogue or whatever. This is like,
yeah, well,
every comma and every I had to be included.
Yeah, but that's kind of hard to hold a movie company to unless you have it in your contract.
It sounds like this commentary track is particularly juicy with details and worth listening to.
It was pretty good. I'm telling you most of the highlights. One other thing that I did not realize, some of you may know that there is a lovely song written for this movie, and instrumental versions of it crop up every time there's a romantic scene. And it is well known, to me at least, as almost a standard of instrumental jazz performers. They really love it just because it's a melodic ballad that they can improvise on. What I didn't realize, first of all, the melody was written by Johnny Mandel and lyrics were by Johnny Mercer. Lots of Johnnies in the movie music business at this time, including that other guy, Williams. But you could not get a song nominated for an Academy Award if the lyrics were not presented in the film also. And so they couldn't get a nomination for it. Hiller just could not figure out a way to bring it into the film, like somebody's hearing it on the radio, maybe.
Right. It would have had to have been something like that.
Yeah. So they just decided just to play it as music, and that's all.
One thing that I noticed in the score, there's and Dan, I don't know if this is the theme you're referencing, but I could almost call it a love theme that crops in occasionally. Yeah. There are 6 bars. Now, I'm sorry, that's Alex North Spartacus. If you listen to his Spartacus love theme, it's the same 6 bars. Wow. So make of that what you will.
Yes,
that's 4 years earlier.
Definitely a resemblance, because I know that score pretty well also.
I agree. There is a resemblance. I'm not sure it's litigatable, but in today's world, maybe. But back then, I think they let it ride.
And another credit behind the scenes that I thought was interesting was additional photography went to Christopher Chalice, who later is going to become a very important cinematographer in the 60s. He photographs Stanley Donin's Two for the Road, Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, did some magnificent lighting work in England.
Yeah, both beautifully shot pictures.
I believe he replaced the fatal Jeffrey Unsworth in Polanski's Tests. I think he finished the film that Unsworth had begun. I think. I wouldn't swear to it.
I think he also had Ghislaine Coquet, the French cinematographer, was involved in Tests as well.
That's probably the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Never mind.
No, but he was just, I mean, very, very distinguished DP. And so a couple of things. I want to get to the actors in a minute, but this comes out 2 years after Darryl Zanuck's production of The Longest Day, which also was about D-Day. And I'm sorry, poor Russia has been written out of the narrative entirely. Russia was not mentioned at all as being part of the D-Day landing. The only reference to Russia here is a pretty nasty comment that Garner says, do these Russians still like their women short, fat, and reactionary? It's like, come on, that's cheap.
I think there's a couple of other pot shots at Russians too. Wasn't there something about the Russians were criticizing American vodka or vice versa?
Yes, that was the other reference. So it's typical Hollywood at the time, playing both sides against the middle and not wanting to upset the Cold War template.
Well, now after we've seen the Saving Private Ryan version of the D-Day landing, and even some of the footage in the recent Yogi Berra documentary, which we're playing here at U Plaza Cinema, it sort of renders utterly absurd James Garner's, running up and down the beach where he would have been dead, in 5 seconds, if that were as true to life as it was presented in those other films.
Absolutely. And when you see this film, you realize how underutilized James Garner was, because he made his big splash on television around 1957 with the TV series Maverick. He did make feature films. I mean, yes, he was in The Great Escape the previous year. He was in Cash McCall 4 years earlier, but they didn't put him in very good films. And a lot of his work that made him more successful was television. But you really did get a sense of his range and his skills here. I just wish we had seen more of this quality for the films he was in.
One of his very last films is a favorite of mine, Robert Benton's Twilight, with Paul Newman, Susan Sarandon.
He's the villain in that film, if I remember correctly.
He is. And it was
we don't often see him.
Yeah.
Later in his career, finally, he's getting some juicier roles like that film, and also Martin Ritz Murphy's Romance with Sally Field. That's a better role for him. Even Victor Victoria. I think his second reteaming with Julie Andrews in 1982. And let's see, James Coburn is also fresh off of The Great Escape and is working his way into becoming a prominent 1960s actor as well.
I found this one of his few irritating performances, James Coburn, but I think that's partly the Chayefsky material, where his rant is almost the most punishing of the three.
I agree with you. I think he was just, he dialed it up way too high in every scene, and he needed to take some lessons from James Garner, who is master at underplaying.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Well, maybe they wanted it that way so that the two were in deep contrast. I mean, even the way Coburn moves is kind of jittery, and Garner kind of glides through the scenes, but Coburn is clearly in a neurotic fit most of the time. So,
and Melvin Douglas had won an Academy Award, I believe, the previous year for his role in HUD by Martin Ritt, and of course he goes way back to MGM in the 1930s, Ninotchka, and even the late 40s movies like Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, and his wife, Helen Douglas, was an important politician who ran afoul of the Nixon mob during the Cold War. And so fascinating political backgrounder to Melvin Douglas, who will later then appear in and win an Academy Award towards the end of his life, and Being There by Hal Ashby.
Presidential advisor.
Exactly, the presidential advisor. So my big question is, did you buy the ending? Was it convincing? I mean, she's doing a major 180 here, Emily. Well, I'm finding that the irony was lost at that time, or whatever was intended irony got swallowed up in this need to have a commercial happy ending. But that's just my take.
And an attempt, in what is perhaps the most cynical moment of all in the film, that final shot where we see some kind of, Iwo Jima-like statue of James Garner that has been subsequently commissioned, where he's, leading the men onto the beach, follow me, boys, or something, into the hail of machine gun fire, and let's see what happens.
Yeah, that puts the ultimate cynical spin on the movie. But what's interesting is in that last scene, not only does she seem to do an about face, but she kind of scolds Garner into doing an about face.
Yes.
So, they're all kind of compromising things that they have said before in order to be together. And I think I believe it when you think someone is dead and you've mourned them and you get the extra blessing of them being alive after all, that can really affect you, I think. It's never happened to me, but I'm imagining what it would be like. And I think that could be an incentive for a lot of changeovers in people's thinking.
Well, in the trailer, they had a clip of her of Julie Andrews when she was lying on top of James Garner on the grass somewhere, and she told him that he lacks principle or principles. Well, we just got done hearing some speeches from him where he's very clearly laying out his historical intellectual objections to war in very rational and I think humanitarian.
I think the word she used was morals, not principles.
I
could be wrong.
I'm not a gambling man, but I'm putting $5 on principles because she said you lack principles, Charlie. I believe Charlie was his character, and then in the end, she's the one who's lacking the principles as she reaches her true Americanization, which I know was intended to be ironic, but I do think because it came so close to the happy ending that the irony got a little swallowed up there, or diluted, I should say.
Well, I think the happy ending helps make it a successful film.
Absolutely.
And, people can walk out smiling and think back on all the humor in it and occasionally reflect on all of the fairly important thinking that's involved in the film too.
Well, when Gary was referencing those other films from 1964, we have to remember that all of these films that Gary cited, including this one, would have been in production when President Kennedy was alive. And there seemed to be, I don't know, this unwritten rule or this unwritten theory that there seems to be a thawing in the government, and maybe we can take a few more political risks and we can look at ourselves and laugh at our mistakes or our ostentatious displays of militarism that would not have been possible under Eisenhower. But then Kennedy was gone by the time these films came out, because 1964, as Gary said, there's a series of these things. And we can even include non-war pictures that dealt cynically with the American political system, such as The Best Man by the
That's right. That was also in 1964. Well, even Eisenhower in his farewell speech, Max, in January of 1961, had that famous speech about the beware of the military-industrial complex or something.
Exactly. So
product.
One interesting footnote to this is that they were actually shooting the movie on November 22nd, 1963, which happened to be Hiller's 40th birthday. And everybody was just stricken emotionally, and they just had to call off shooting. It was on a Friday. I think they had called it off until the following Monday, probably. But, these were people who were probably very sympathetic to Kennedy, I imagine. And
yeah, that also happened around the time that Dr. Strangelove was in production in the UK. Many of you are probably familiar that originally ended with a pie fight sequence in the war room in which the president gets hit with a pie, and the line was, "The president has been struck down in his prime," and that all had to be cut. And
I don't think that's ever been publicly shown, though, Max.
I'm sure. I know. Tragically, I suspect the footage was probably destroyed. But
I may have told the story on this program before, where a couple of years after Stanley Kubrick died, there was a documentary called Stanley Kubrick: A Life in Pictures.
Yes.
And it was screened at Lincoln Center. Not really meant for theatrical release, but a bunch of us went to see it. And Jan Harlan was sort of the Stanley's brother-in-law, the producer director of this film. It was decent for what it was, but I think we saw a couple of shots of the pie fight. They were taken by Ouija, the famous photographer, was an on-set photographer that very quickly passed by in this movie. So I asked the question afterwards. I said, well, Mr. Harlan, does this pie fight footage still exist? And are we ever going to see it as a DVD extra or whatever? And he says, yes, of course I have it in the warehouse, but you're not going to see it because Stanley did not want you to see it. So that's the answer to that.
Wow. Wow.
Okay, so maybe some of Stanley's descendants,
right,
grandson will say, it's time, we can let it.
It's time, right.
So it's in any event, so Americanization of Emily is coming out at an interesting time, and it's sort of going into that weird thaw between, you know, the Kennedy Johnson era leading into the counterculture and the more dramatic anti-war movement that's going to spring up, so that the James Garner character won't seem so out of place in a few years in a motion picture, at least from Hollywood, as this counterculture energy is starting to take hold or being felt in the culture here. You know, any more observations before we start opening things up to questions?
One other thing here. Hiller reported that they got no government cooperation on getting ordinary military supplies like boats and tanks and trucks that a lot of Hollywood films would get. Apparently, during a party at Hiller's home, somebody came up to Hiller and said, I just thought you'd want to know that since the party started, Keenan Wynn has consumed an entire bottle of vodka by himself.
Getting into character.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I think that's all I got.
That's pretty good. So I was going to think, I thought of something and it went right out of my head. But this was a success in 1964, and as I mentioned, Julie Andrews was just getting started writing this.
Do we know, did this come out before Mary Poppins, Max, or after?
After, if I'm not mistaken, Dan, would have been after. Mary Poppins was first, then came Americanization.
Quite a year for her.
Quite a year for her. She had made an impact on Broadway in the 1950s in Sandy Wilson's The Boyfriend. And then, of course, she will appear as Eliza Doolittle on stage in My Fair Lady. And then she will be better known as being Blake Edwards' wife, as appearing in some of his motion pictures as well.
And then she did that nude scene in SOB.
In 1981.
Yeah, who was expecting that? I don't know.
Well, I don't envy the image she was having to battle, because between Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, she had this squeaky clean goody two-shoes image. So clearly she was trying to.
This film is an anomaly in her career, really into the late 70s or 80s, I think, and makes you wonder where she might have gone if life or the times had taken her in another direction as an actress, because she's very appealing.
She is.
Definitely, it's a character that has some edge to it, without a doubt, without a question.
You really fall in love with her. I mean, she's
radiant.
Yeah, she's gorgeous, and she's confrontational and romantic and intelligent and everything.
Dignified.
Yes.
All of the above.
Yeah. You're a bit of a prig, Miss Barham. I don't mean to be. Okay, that's an interesting interchange.
And the film, even though, Dan, you had pointed out it wasn't revolutionary in terms of its visual look, it was nominated for an Academy Award for cinematography, which is fascinating.
Were they still separating black and white and color at that point?
I think so, up until like the mid 60s, right? With Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that might have been the last year.
Yeah, around 66.
Yeah.
Also the production design, that was the only other Oscar nomination.
In any event, before we open things up to questions and comments, just a reminder, a week from Wednesday on June 21st, I am going to repeat my 1971, The Year in Film presentation on that remarkable cinema year, 1971. And just to give you a taste of the eccentric and eclectic nature of 1971, here's a little teaser. That last image from Milos Forman's first American film, Taking Off, with Buck.
And Max, you probably know the French Connection has been in the news recently, and there's a big article coming out in the Times about that this week.
Well, it's about time somebody write about it, because it was actually broken by a blogger. It's Hollywood Elsewhere. They broke the fact that the Criterion Channel, perhaps by no fault of its own, was airing a slightly censored version that was removing some ethnic expletives that the Popeye Doyle character utters. And Criterion may not have been aware that Disney monkeyed with it now that they own the Fox library. So,
well, the Times is Glenn Keddy it was quoted somewhere saying he's going to set the whole story straight in a few days in the paper. So hopefully before your broadcast.
Thank you for bringing that to my attention, Gary. And at this point, thank you so much, gentlemen. At this point, let us now, I'll turn to our hostess to see if we can take some questions or thoughts from our.
Hey, everyone. If you want to ask a question, you go to the reaction button, raise your hand. But Joshua, go ahead and unmute and start your video.
Yes, I had two questions. Given the Helen Gahagan Douglas debacle, I think it was particularly gutsy to use Melvyn Douglas in this picture. And I'm wondering whether there was any overflow about the whole communist thing that affected the picture. The second thing I wanted to mention was that you talked about Johnny Mercer writing the music for this picture. Didn't Johnny Mercer also write the music for Seven Brides?
It was Johnny Mandel who wrote the music. Johnny Mercer wrote the lyrics for Emily.
Right,
That's
Johnny
as I
Mandel
And
wrote
Seven
the music
Brides,
to
I
match,
can't-
also very similar lampooning of military themes.
Yes.
You can see in this.
And Joshua, a fascinating question about the political links here, because Melvyn Douglas's wife, she was red baited by Nixon and others at the height of the Cold War. And I am not aware of there being any political fallout for this film as a result of Douglas being in it. I don't know if you gentlemen have heard otherwise, but I'm certainly not aware of by this time, by 1964, it was getting a little harder to discredit an entire film in the way that might have been possible 5-6 years earlier. Maybe you gentlemen know otherwise. I haven't heard that there was any specific fallout because of Melvyn Douglas's wife's political experiences during the Cold War.
Yeah, that would have been almost been 15 years prior at that point.
Exactly.
In case we lost Dan, it seems like his video froze, so he'll probably.
Okay. Well, Dan, we'll look forward to Dan rejoining us.
Yes.
Any other questions at this
There were
time?
some questions here. Do you think the fact that the movie was filmed in black and white, like a normal World War II movie, was a way to set up the audience to expect a different kind of message?
Ooh, if I had to, no, that's heavy.
Yeah.
If I had to venture a guess, I would say that it was done probably for budgetary reasons, because it was still a less expensive thing to do, to shoot it in
Yeah,
black and
I
white.
think that's probably it.
And
And
if you look at a
also,
lot of the 64 films that you guys have mentioned,
they're all black and white.
They're all black and white. You know, this was maybe like the tail end of,
And then we had a big production in Harm's Way the following year in '65, also in black and white.
Also in black and white. And it does carry that sort of newsreel quality, and also enables the filmmakers to be able to cut into and use newsreel footage without audiences noticing it that much,
Yeah,
although we
even if
obviously do.
very poorly in this film, as you know.
Yes, it's exactly. But anyway, that was a good question. Anybody else? Any other questions? Even
a
chat
couple of
questions.
people, and this is really an opinion, I think. Andrews already did a major changeover in the beginning, which I didn't buy either. I referred to her suddenly falling in love with Garner after being very critical of him. And then someone else agreed with it, but then Sean chimed in and said, because he's James Garner. And I fell in love with him that he knew Italian crystal or Danish crystal and Italian lace. And he was so metrosexual. It's like,
well, the thing about James Garner is you can't stay angry at him very long. He's so damn charming that even if she was annoyed with him, of course she's going to fall for him. Yeah. But I guess my issues had more to do with maybe some of the political debates they were having, and whether those transitions that took place were that convincing. But
I just wanted to say,
yes, Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I loved it because to me this is indeed the ultimate anti-war film, and you should know that I was in the service, and just even before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, we were shooting at North Korean ships and Chinese ships. And they were shooting back at us.
Wow.
It was not well publicized, but that's why I love this. It's the ultimate anti-war film.
That's
and
very
thank
powerful.
you both. Thank you all.
Joshua, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
That's
that's a fact I was not aware of. We'll have to see if Robert Caro gets into that in his book about LBJ when that comes out.
With Joyce Grenfell, who deserves a shout out, playing her mother. She was a fantastic British comedian. We associate her with a lot of British comedies from the 40s. And she's wonderful here because you see her comedic side, but you also see her dramatic side, which we didn't get to see very often. And I was fascinated by the reaction she had to Garner's commentary when the three of them are having tea in the back of the house. When she
Go ahead.
No, when he makes some comments that offend Julie Andrews, but that her mother becomes very affected by. I thought that was fascinating how she reacted to that. And then a different side of Joyce Grenfell.
Someone has a question. Lou Brothers, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, this is just a comment about the song Emily. For those who are interested in hearing it, Andy Williams had a version of that was popular at the time, and I just checked, it's available on his Greatest Hits album. So if you want to follow up with that song, there's where you can find it.
Someone else,
I believe
Tony Bennett sang it.
The late, great Bill Evans did a wonderful, marvelous solo improvisation on it in one of his piano albums. So
yes, he did.
It's been well covered.
Yeah, that's the version of Spartacus that sticks in my mind. The Bill Evans Conversations with Myself version.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lou.
Someone was also saying in the chat that they didn't really buy the mother, like just kind of snapping out of it, during that little tea, which I kind of agree with that. I just chalk it off to its film, it's like.
Well, I'm not sure she snapped out of it then. It was days later, after her daughter had been mourning Charlie, that she finally gave a snap out of it lecture to her.
No, but the
she had-
mother snaps out of it after James Garner comes for tea, is what the
No,
person.
what we see is her crying as they walk out of the garden. And then we don't see her until later while Emily is mourning Garner. So it wasn't a quick snap sort of thing. It took her some time to heal.
What I saw was her reacting first when she was making some observations, and forgive me, I'm not quoting verbatim, about warfare. Oh, you know how these wars are. We're the ones left behind to bury our loved ones or whatever. And then James Garner makes his comments, and then you can see in Joyce Grenfeld's face that she's very impacted by his words.
Right.
And maybe that was the transition somebody was commenting on.
Yeah.
But my favorite comment in the chat, Adelia Smith writes about James, agreed about James Garner. Julie Andrews said he was the best kisser she'd ever known.
Better than Blake? My gosh.
Well,
Okay.
I'm just going here.
You guys, Marjorie Gerd also has a question.
Go ahead, Marjorie.
Oh yeah, thanks. For some reason, my hand doesn't stay up. Anyway, I did from the beginning get the impression that this was an anti-glorification of war movie, but I also saw the hypocrisy in it on them both, like especially with the ending, where she actually throws his own words back at him, and he sees it and he takes it. So there's a bit of hypocrisy there with them both. And the glorification issue is, here is this general, and his goal is to have the first dead man on Omaha Beach be a Navy man. That's his goal, not to preserve life, but like, let's get a picture of that first dead man. So I think it's showing you where the higher ups are, who are living in the lap of luxury, and their main thing is getting a great meal and a fourth for bridge, and other people are really going to their death. So it's the anti-glorification and the hypocrisy of it is what I saw.
Very true.
And totally throughout the movie, totally contrasty, funny, sad, right, wrong, all the time. And I think in times of war, civilians and soldiers, they kind of do what's good for them at the moment to survive, just to survive.
Powerful one. And it does remind us why they were not able to get armed forces cooperation in the making of the movie either. There's no way the armed forces would have agreed to provide whatever hardware the producers needed, given the cynical take on the actions of the military characters. So
only John Wayne got that for the Green Berets later on.
Well, right. But it's like, here are the generals living it up and others are being sent to their death. Absolutely. Why would the armed forces cooperate?
Precisely. That's
okay,
Well,
thank you.
Thank you,
Nice to be here.
I don't know about anyone else
Marjorie.
here, but I'm going to go get a Hershey bar.
Good one.
Thank you, Joshua.
Joshua,
And on
make
that
sure,
note, I think that kind of covers things. So this has been a wonderful.
make sure when you eat it that you do it unregenerately.
There you go.
Only
At
Patty
my-
could come up with a
at
word
my
like that.
age, most things I eat, I do unregenerately.
Very good.
Oh, well, there's another line that he has in the film where I think it's Garner is criticizing somebody in the military or some group of people, and he calls them a bunch of banal bogeys. That was his, the only time that line ever appeared in a studio film.
That's great.
And also killing hundreds of billions in the name of humanity. I love that line.
Brilliant.